Good morning, everyone. Buenas tardes. Good day. And welcome to today's webinar where we'll be discussing the impact of gun violence on our Latino communities and Latino families. My name is Javier Martinez, and I'm the Managing Director of National Policy for Abriendo Puertas, Opening Doors. Abriendo Puertas is a leadership development and advocacy program that is led for and by Latino parents with young children. The mission of Abriendo Puertas is to honor and support parents as leaders of their families and their child's first and most influential teacher. We have families that are active in more than 40 states across the country. Today, we are joined by experts from a number of organizations who have dedicated their time to research, organize, and advocate on this important issue. I'd like to start by honoring the victims of the Uvalde mass shooting a year ago yesterday, and honoring their memories through the work that we all do every single day. I'd like to thank our co-host for today, BSP Research, the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, and UnidosUS for sharing their time and expertise with us. I also want to thank our team at Abriendo Puertas, particularly Debbie Ignacio and Josefina Bojorquez, for their hard work behind the scenes pulling this together. A few logistical items. At the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a globe. If you click on the globe, you'll be able to access simultaneous Spanish language interpretation for those who are Spanish speakers. For our presenters, I'll remind you to please speak slowly and clearly to ensure that interpretation can be done appropriately. Also know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the slides and the webinar on our websites at a later time. For all of you joining us to view this webinar, we have a question and answer option, and you can begin to type those questions, and time permitting at the end of the presentations, we will get to as many of those as we can. In early 2023, Abriendo Puertas, UnidosUS, and BSP Research released a national survey of 1,300 Latino families with young children, and among the results, gun violence was one of the top concerns of Latino families. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Gabriel Sanchez, Vice President of Research at BSP Research, a leading survey firm focused on the Latino community, who has conducted our last two Abriendo Puertas surveys and who will be leading our next research project. Dr. Sanchez, I pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Javier. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second to get this up and running. Hopefully everything looks as it should. I appreciate the warm welcome and the opportunity to continue to partner with you, Javier, and your team at Abriendo Puertas, and to all of the other partners that are participating in this important webinar. As Javier noted, obviously, this is an anniversary of another unfortunate tragic event in Uvalde, Texas, that unfortunately is just a microcosm of the larger reality of the situation of gun violence and gun rights policy. And hopefully the data that I'll share with you today provides some perspective on how the Latino population, and specifically Latino families, are experiencing these tragedies and how it's impacting their policy views on this important subject of gun control policy. As Javier noted, this is one of several surveys that we partnered with Abriendo Puertas to conduct specifically of Latino families. I won't spend a lot of time on methodology, but I'm happy to speak to this in Q&A, or if folks would like to email me any questions about our methodology, the sample for this survey, or any specific questions about the findings, I'd be happy to get back to you over email if time does not permit during Q&A. I'll draw your attention to the large sample size, an N of 1,300. Latino parents, primary caregivers, and one of the unique aspects of this particular survey is that we had enough expecting families to be able to break them out in the results of the survey, and I'll showcase some of the important reasons for that subsample as I walk through the presentation. This was specifically of families of young children, so you see children ages of 0 to 5 living in the homes. It had an oversample of New Mexico and Los Angeles County. For folks interested in those subsamples, again, you could email me and I can provide you with some results specific to those communities. At BSP Research, we take great pride in our cultural sensitivity in tracking data for the Latino population. So we always use a blended approach, including web-based and telephone interviews, both landlines and cell phones for telephones. And all of this is fully bilingual. So respondents have the opportunity to participate in English or Spanish or bilingually. And I will again note a couple of places in this survey where having the Spanish capacity was important, because we do find important differences among our English and Spanish speaking families across the country. This was among the first to have content specific to gun violence and gun policy among Latino families. So hopefully the data will provide some context to some of the work that all of you folks are doing on the ground on these important issues. One of the ways we try to track the salience or importance of any particular issue to the Latino community is by always starting our surveys with a very direct question of what are the most important issues facing the Latino or Hispanic community that you think government should address. And you see when we frame it in a broad way, and this is open-ended, allowing Latino parents and primary caregivers to provide any response that they like, you see that gun violence and mass shootings is a top 5 level priority for Latino parents and primary caregivers across the nation. This is pretty unique. If we think back to prior to 2020, I never saw gun violence or mass shootings even among the top 15, much less the top 5 issue priorities for Latino families. And particularly within the context of the economic climate, racial and structural violence and discrimination, healthcare costs, and even immigration, you see that addressing gun violence and mass shootings was a higher priority across a number of different issue areas that are perceived to be important to the Latino community. For some context on our large sample of Latino voters in the 2020 National Election Survey that we conducted with the African American Research Collaborative, in that survey, very consistent with what we find here for Latino parents, 24% of Latino voters named gun violence and mass shootings as one of their top concerns. So however you slice it, as we've been tracking this issue over time, Latinos across the country are indicating that gun violence and particularly mass shootings are a heavy priority for them. As I noted, with the rich sample size that we have to work with for this survey, we're able to look at a number of different subgroups across the Latino population, obviously recognizing Latinos, like most diverse communities in the country, are not monolithic. Right. So in this context, when we look specifically at Spanish-speaking Latino families, you see gun violence and mass shootings an even higher priority, 14% higher than the overall sample of Latino parents and primary caregivers. And you see that it rises well above even improving wages and income. So this issue is important to all Latino families, but particularly those that are Spanish dominant. Folks have asked me when they've seen our data, what might explain the high salience level of gun violence and mass shootings among Latinos in particular. And I think one of the reasons is, unfortunately, as you see here, the lived experience of Latino families across the country is unfortunately riddled with direct experiences with gun violence. You see, when we look at the overall sample, nearly 1/5 at 18% of respondents have either themselves or think about the sobering reality, their children been at a school or a public place during a violent shooting incident. When we look specifically at expecting parents, that number jumps even higher to over 1 in 4 expected parents have been at a school or a public place during a violent shooting incident. Just reflect on that data for a moment of the high percentage of expecting families who have unfortunately had this reality be part of their lived experience and come into the prospect of raising children in a world in which they have to be strongly concerned about their kids facing this reality themselves. Reinforcing that unfortunate reality, when we ask folks directly, how concerned are you that your child could be a victim of a mass shooting at some point in their life? Look at the sobering reality that over 60% of the full sample indicate that they're concerned that their child could be a victim of a mass shooting. In fact, the converse of that is only 3% of the full sample indicate that they're not at all concerned about their child being a victim of a mass shooting at some point in their lifetime. Right? So again, very sobering data, unfortunately, that I think provides some context to the ways in which Latino parents and primary caregivers are reacting to the policy environment right now related to gun control, violence more broadly. Similarly to what we found across the full sample, this concern is even greater among expecting parents and households and Spanish dominant Latino parents. You see that if overall 62% of the sample indicates they're concerned their child could be a victim of a mass shooting at some point in their life, look at how that jumps to an alarming 80% among Spanish dominant and bilingual Latino families across the country. It's not surprising as I close and transition to policy priorities among Latino families across the country Given the backdrop of these experiences and these high level of concern, you see that 90% of Latino parents and primary caregivers across the full sample believe that it is important that policymakers in their state take more aggressive steps to reduce the number of mass shootings. You see even higher salience, 95% among Spanish speakers. I've been polling among Latinos for almost 20 years, and I'll tell you that it's nearly impossible to see this level of consensus on policy items. So the fact that especially among Spanish speakers, you reach near 100% of perceived importance gives some context to just how important reducing mass shootings are to the Latino community. In closing, in the survey, we polled on a number of different gun control policies. I highlight just a handful of those for you today that exemplify that when you ask Latinos about common sense approaches to addressing gun violence and mass shootings, you see overwhelming support. Whether that's looking at covering the sale of guns in their state to be much more strict and stringent at 84%, or requiring a 10-day waiting period to purchase a firearm at 80%, you see Latinos overwhelmingly support common sense approaches to addressing the reality that we have right now of just far too many guns in the population and it being far too easy for individuals to gain access to a firearm. I always like to see important variation across public policy issues when we're polling among Latinos or any other community. So the fact that you see significant drop-off from these high-level, almost 90% support across some of the more liberal or progressive approaches to gun control or violence, and a significant drop-off of over 30% in some cases on some of the more conservative items on the survey, including that all people should be able to own firearms without limit or restriction. Look at how that drops by a significant margin of over 30%. So hopefully this data provides some important data to reinforce what I think a lot of you folks are unfortunately seeing on the ground. And I hope it's helpful for all of your advocacy efforts. Hopefully collectively we can work to push policymakers at both the federal, state, and local levels to do something about this important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez, for that fascinating data and for presenting us with such compelling arguments for advocacy and action with regard to policy. Next, I'd like to introduce former United States Representative Debbie Mucarsel-Powell and Alex Nguyen. Debbie Mucarsel-Powell is a senior advisor at the Giffords Center to Prevent Gun Violence. The Congresswoman was also the first South American-born immigrant ever elected to the U.S. Congress. After her father's tragic murder, Congresswoman has dedicated her life to common sense gun reform. In Congress, she served as vice chair of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. Before her time in Congress, she served in various posts at Florida International University. Alex Nguyen is the research manager for Giffords. He uses data and evidence to look for new perspectives and approaches to gun violence prevention and has authored memos on gun violence in different communities, including one on gun violence in Hispanic and Latino communities. Alex received a master's degree in public health and a master's in Asian American studies, both from UCLA. I'll pass it on to the two of you.
Thank you, Javier. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. Can everybody see and hear me? Are we good? Okay. So hello, everybody. As Javier mentioned, my name is Alex Nguyen. I am the research manager here at Giffords, and today I'm going to be speaking and building on what Dr. Sanchez just talked about. We're going to be talking about what gun violence looks like in Hispanic and Latino communities, and then what are some of the policies that we can enact to help stop this increase in violence. Just as a little background, Giffords is a nonprofit organization founded by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and her husband, Mark Kelly. We're a national gun violence prevention advocacy organization, meaning we work with lawmakers to get gun safety laws passed that will help stop the rising gun violence. We help to bring lawsuits that hold the gun industry accountable, and we look to research to make sure that the policies we advocate for are safe and effective. Let's go back. So for the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about what gun violence looks like in the Hispanic and Latino community across the country. I'm going to use Hispanic and Latino sort of interchangeably throughout this presentation. But gun violence in this community is predominantly gun homicides. Close to 6 in 10 Latino gun deaths are gun homicides or incidents where one person shoots and kills someone else. The other main form of gun violence is gun suicide, where 4 in 10 gun deaths are gun suicides. This trend among Latino gun deaths, where it's mostly gun homicides, is different from nationally. You might see nationally that gun suicide is actually more common than gun homicide, but in this particular community, that dynamic is flipped. Now, because gun homicide is the main form of gun violence in the Latino community, the next few points and slides are going to focus just on that. In fact, gun violence, and mainly gun homicide, has been the leading cause of death for Latino boys ages 15 to 19. And this problem isn't going away. Over the last 10 years, the total number of gun deaths in the Latino community has increased 88%, or in other words, it's nearly doubled. Like I said in the last slide, over the past 10 years, gun violence has risen substantially. And that top black line is what you can see is the total number of gun deaths by year. And then the middle blue line is the total number of gun homicides by year. The bottom red line is the total number of gun suicides. Gun violence has been rising even before the pandemic, but like the rest of the country, the number of gun deaths, and in this particular community, in the Latino community, gun homicides rose dramatically during the pandemic. It has started to taper off, but between 2020 and 2021, those gun deaths rose substantially. As we've seen, sort of that gun homicides are the main form of gun violence in the Latino and Hispanic community. But as you might expect, gun violence doesn't happen the same across different communities. For example, on this left side here, there's a comparison of gun homicides on a national level. Now, nationally, Latinos make up 19% of the population, but only 16% of gun homicides. And if you only looked at those two bars, you might come across saying, well, that's not that bad. But if you look at different states across the country with larger proportions of Latino population, you might see a different story. So I have two examples here. Let's look at the middle, where at California, where Latinos make up 40% of the population, or 4 in 10 people, but nearly half of all gun homicides. That's a significant overrepresentation in the number of gun homicide victims that are Latino compared to the population. And a similar picture emerges in New Mexico, where Latinos are half the population, but 62% of gun homicides. What these bars are intended to show is that gun violence behaves differently in different communities, even within sort of a broader Hispanic and Latino community. And now gun violence is a uniquely American phenomenon. And after seeing these slides, let's talk a little bit about what we can do. It just so happens that this year is Giffords' 10-year anniversary as an organization. And over the last 10 years, our main and most effective strategy is that stronger gun laws save lives. By passing stronger gun laws, we want to make sure that people who want to buy a gun can do so in a safe manner, and that it doesn't make it more dangerous for everyone else. And as Dr. Sanchez noted, these laws are popular among Latino parents. On the slide on the right here is a graph from the Giffords annual gun law scorecard, where we rank each state by how strong their gun laws are. The higher the state, the more gun deaths they have, and then the further to the left a state is, the stronger the gun laws. And as you can see, states like California, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York have stronger gun laws and see lower rates of gun violence compared to other states like Mississippi, Wyoming, Arkansas, Missouri that have weaker gun laws and higher rates of gun violence. I've been talking a lot about sort of stronger gun laws, but what do these laws look like? The first law I want to talk about is called a universal background check. So right now, if you want to buy a gun from a federally licensed seller, you have to go through a background check. But in many states across the country, anyone other than those federally licensed sellers, so if there's a private seller, or even if you go to a gun show, gun buyers do not have to go through a background check before purchasing a gun. Now, according to some recent research, roughly 22%, or a little bit more than 1 in 5 guns purchased were purchased without a background check. That means that anyone who might have been stopped through a traditional background check because they either have a history of domestic violence, a violent crime, or mental health issues can purchase a gun without a background check. Now, these guns can go on to be used in crime or even trafficked to places like Central and South America, where most of the guns used there are originally sold in the US. By enacting these laws, we would make sure anybody buying a gun or receiving a gun from another person has to go through a background check, where they go through a licensed seller, an unlicensed seller, or a gun show, or anything else. Now, the next type of gun safety law we could pass are called safe storage laws, or sometimes called child access prevention laws. These laws that would require that everyone store their guns in a safe manner, meaning unloaded and locked so that only the gun owner can access it. These laws are important in particular for keeping guns out of the hands of children. Approximately 4.6 million children across the country live in a home with a gun. That puts them at risk for finding the gun and using it in a way that maybe they didn't intend to. While some parents might think that merely hiding the gun from their children is sufficient, according to one survey, a third of children can access a gun in their home in 5 minutes, and the percentage of children that can access a gun in less than an hour is even higher. Now, these are really effective at lowering rates of gun violence. These laws have been proven by research to be really effective at lowering rates of gun violence, including firearm suicide and unintentional shooting deaths. In fact, states with child access prevention laws saw those two outcomes decrease by 54%, and these are some of the most effective tools we have at lowering gun violence in every community. The next gun safety law I want to highlight are what are called red flag laws, or sometimes called extreme risk protection orders. These are laws that empower family members and law enforcement to petition a court to restrict access to firearms for somebody they believe to be a risk to hurt themselves or others. In other words, if you think a loved one is a danger to themselves or others, you can go and ask the court to temporarily make sure they can't access their firearms so that they don't become a danger to anyone else. These laws have been shown to lower rates of gun suicide in states that have them, and in some limited cases, help stop mass shootings. You'll hear a lot about these laws after mass shootings. We heard a lot about them after Uvalde. And while I've been talking a lot about these gun laws, a lot of these have been effective at lowering gun suicide. But since gun homicides are the main form of gun violence that affects Hispanic and Latino communities, I wanted to talk about not necessarily a gun law, but a type of program that has been really successful across the country at lowering gun homicide. These are called community violence interventions. We have a whole center at Giffords dedicated to them. They're community-led programs that try to interrupt or stop gun violence before they happen by targeting those who are most at risk for gun violence. Now, these programs can take many forms. For instance, there are hospital-based programs which target folks coming into the emergency room for gun injuries. There are street outreach programs that target those most at risk for gun violence. And then there are case management programs which provide social services so that we can prevent gun violence from happening in the first place. These types of programs have been really successful in large and small cities across the country. In one program here in California, in the cities of Sacramento and Stockton, during the pandemic, so as you saw on those previous slides, during the pandemic, gun violence increased dramatically. But during the pandemic in Stockton and Sacramento, the areas of those cities with this CVI program saw a 15% decrease in the number of gun violence victims. These programs are also really cost effective. In this particular program, they saved the taxpayers millions of dollars by diverting individuals from the criminal justice and medical systems. Okay, well, these are all great programs and policies. We wanted everybody else to hear about how they can also get involved. And for this, I will turn it over to my colleague, former Congresswoman Debbie Mucarsel-Powell. Debbie.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Everyone can hear me, correct? Yeah, okay, good. First of all, I want to say thank you. Muchísimas gracias, Abriendo las Puertas, to bring together our Latino Hispanic communities and everyone that really needs to get involved in addressing this gun violence epidemic. I was born in Ecuador. I came to the United States when I was 14, and I first moved to California. I understand very well the challenges that we face in that community, in our Latino community in California. And when I was 24, I was getting a master's degree in California, and I received a call that my father had been shot and killed by a criminal with a gun in Ecuador. And that was a moment that really changed my life forever. I miss my father every single day. It was a very traumatic experience to have to bury my father, seeing those gunshot wounds. And I talk about it like this because this is an issue that's affecting so many Latinos here in the United States and also in the entire hemisphere. And yet we don't talk about this issue. There's a certain shame associated with having a family member killed by a gun and by gun violence. And that has to change, because this is disproportionately affecting Latino communities here in the United States. Many of us fled the violence in Latin America to come here, seeking safety and opportunities for our children. And yet here we are with fear of sending our children to school, scared to go out to the grocery store because there may be a shooter out and about, especially now that we're honoring the victims of the Uvalde shooting. I know that this is a top of mind issue for so many Latinos here in this country. And so I was in Congress, I was in the Judiciary Committee. The Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, appointed me to that committee to deal specifically with gun violence because of my story, and also to deal with immigration issues. So you can imagine those two are interconnected in so many ways. After I was not reelected in 2020, I've been involved with Giffords. I'm their senior advisor, doing this work, doing outreach to Latino communities all over the country. And time again, the stories are the same. Latino families are petrified. They know that we're losing Latino boys at a very, very fast rate, and this continues to increase. And I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be this way. This is happening in the United States uniquely. It's a unique problem to this country. There are a lot of things that we can do, and that's why it is so important to have your civic engagement. The first thing I'm going to ask, lo primero que les voy a pedir, go to giffords.org. Tenemos una página en español. We have a page in Spanish as well. Learn about Giffords. We are a foundation. We provide a lot of educational programs. We're also a political action committee. We make sure that we elect candidates. I was the first South American born to ever be elected to the US Congress. And that was thanks to groups like Giffords that supported my campaign, that knew that I was going to work on this issue. And so you have a lot of power of getting involved, joining our group. Look at the candidates that we endorse. Look at your local candidates, your state candidates. Who is going to support passing gun safety legislation? Because the problem in many ways is simple. We have an easy access to gun problem in America, and that has to change. And it starts by passing gun safety laws. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, make sure that they have the information that they need to make informed choices when they come to the ballot box. Get registered to vote. Our Latino community is the largest ethnic group in this country that can shape the elections in 2024. It is incredibly important for you to get involved, to be registered, to help your neighbors and your family and your friends to get registered. There are many ways to do it. Use social media posts. Make sure that you lift up good information that will help your community get activated. Write a letter to your local elected representative. Ask them to consider passing gun safety legislation. Again, this should not be political. This is about safety. It's about our families. It's about our children. I'm a mom of 2 school-aged children, and I can't tell you how much I think about this every single day. But I know that together we can change this, and that's why I'm doing this work. And I'm very excited and grateful for Abriendo Puertas to bringing us together and talking about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you, Alex, for that sobering presentation and for this call to action. At the end of the day, this is why we do the work that we do at Abriendo Puertas, and I know so many of our partners as well, and that is to, in fact, move people toward action. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate your time very, very much. Next, I'd like to introduce Umalia Fatima. She is based in Washington, D.C., and is a policy analyst for the UnidosUS Health Policy Program. Her work with UnidosUS focuses on improving the health and well-being of the Latino community through improvements to food and nutrition policy, as well as gun violence prevention policy. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., UnidosUS is the largest national Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. And as I stated earlier, they are a key partner of Abriendo Puertas in the production and release of this annual survey that is the focus of today's webinar. Umalia, I pass it on to you.
Thanks, Javier, and hi, everyone. I hope you all can see my slides and hear me okay, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all and with my fellow co-panelists. A huge thank you to you all for all of your work and your voices on this issue. And I'm really grateful to have the chance to share with you more about such a timely and critical issue for the Latino community. So to give you an idea of what I'll be sharing with you all today, I'll start with some background information about the toll of gun violence on Latino communities and point to some results from our own polling of Latino voters. And then I'll move into some evidence-based policy solutions to address the issues of gun safety and gun violence. Some of it might be a little bit repetitive from what others have focused on here today, so I'll try to move through some of that quickly. So almost exactly 1 year ago today, on May 24th, 2022, a mass shooting that killed 21 children and teachers in Uvalde, Texas, shed light on the devastating effects of gun violence on Latinos. But unfortunately, this wasn't the first time a mass shooting caused the Latino community to suffer from such significant grief. In August of 2019, a white supremacist gunman drove to a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, where he targeted Latino shoppers, shooting 46 people, half of whom died. And in years prior, in May 2016, a shooter entered Pulse, an LGBTQ+ nightclub in Orlando, Florida, during a Latin night event and shot 102 people, 49 of whom died. While mass shootings are highly visible events, more day-to-day gun violence is an epidemic in communities across the nation and specifically enacts a terrible toll on the Latino community. And hate-motivated violence and anti-Hispanic hate crimes fuel this day-to-day gun violence epidemic, as well as the mass shootings that we've mentioned. In fact, a Department of Justice report back from 2017 found that Hispanic people experienced a higher rate of violent hate crimes than did white and Black people. Now, I want to share some numbers with you to give you a better idea of the significant impact that gun violence has on Latinos. Every year, more than 4,700 Latinos die from gun violence in the US. That's about 13 preventable Latino deaths per day. And in addition to the more than 4,700 Latinos who are killed from gun violence, 13,300 are shot and injured. These numbers put Latinos as being twice as likely to die by gun violence and 4 times as likely to be injured by a gun compared to white people. And as we know well, this isn't an issue that only affects Latino adults. Our Latino children and teens are 3 times more likely to be killed by guns than their white peers. And another area to consider is the impact of policing on Latinos, with more than 180 Latinos being shot and killed by the police in an average year. It's also important to get an idea of how the different types of gun violence affect Latinos. Alex gave us a pretty good idea of this data, but here's just another way of looking at it. We looked at CDC data from the years of 2018 to 2021, and this chart shows the distribution of violent deaths among Latinos, of gun violence deaths, among Latinos. So we can see, which Alex pointed out, is that homicides make up 61% of Latino gun violence deaths, and suicide comes in at second, with accounting for 37% of gun deaths among Latinos. And from the Latino community's perspective, it's really important for policymakers to enact solutions to homicide, but also suicide, unintentional shootings, and non-fatal assaults. And now that we have all of this data, what do Latino community members specifically think of this? Dr. Sanchez gave us a good idea of this already, but with the shock of the devastating shooting in Uvalde 1 year ago, addressing gun violence has clearly risen dramatically as a priority for Latino voters in recent years. A national poll of Latino voters that we conducted along with Mi Familia Vota last summer shows that addressing gun violence is among the most important issues for Latino voters, and Latinos strongly support policies to address them. When Latino voters were asked about what they meant when they talked about gun violence as a top priority issue, a majority of them noted that guns are too easy to access, and there's a need to prevent school-based shootings, and finally, there's a need for community violence intervention and mental health programs. Now that we know a little bit more about the Latino stakes in gun violence and gun safety, I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about some of the policy interventions that should be taken to protect communities of color and address the disproportionate impact of gun violence on Latinos in the US. And to do this, we've developed a framework for these policy solutions, which I'll be referring to as the 5 pillars of Latino policy interests in gun violence. And these pillars, many of which we've just heard about from other experts in the field, include things like gun violence prevention, gun safety, community violence intervention, school-based attacks, and mental health supports. And we'll be going through each of these in more detail. So addressing gun violence isn't simple, but having multiple levers is much better than one, especially when it comes to gun violence prevention. In order to reduce and prevent gun violence, evidence shows that having multiple safety measures actually reduces deaths and injuries from firearms. And this figure points out many of the evidence-based policies that affect different outcomes. It's a little confusing, I know, to follow the lines, so I'll walk you through an example of what this figure shows. So looking at the left and following the brown line, this figure shows that waiting periods may decrease suicide rates. The thicker the line on the figure, the stronger the evidence. And some other gun violence prevention policies to consider that are evidence-based include things like background checks prior to gun purchases and closing loopholes in gun sales, safer storage and extreme risk laws, assault weapons bans, and requiring permits and licenses when purchasing and possessing a gun, prohibiting people convicted of hate crimes from having guns, implementing policies that reduce gun violence by police, and implementing community-based programs to address risks of gun violence. I also want to talk a little bit about gun safety specifically. So while access to assault weapons is rightfully a focus of efforts to improve gun safety, it's also important to understand that rifles, which include what we know as assault weapons, were involved in 3% of firearm murders in 2020, while handguns were involved in 59% of gun murders and non-negligent manslaughters in the US. As Alex mentioned, extreme risk laws allow family members and law enforcement to ask a judge for an order to temporarily remove guns from a person who poses a risk of injuring others or themselves with a gun. Another evidence-based policy to consider are minimum age requirements for gun purchases and possession. Both of these policies limit youth access to guns and limit the availability of firearms to young people, and therefore can reduce gun violence and unintentional shootings that young adults may commit. Safe storage laws are also supported by a strong body of evidence that show that they can substantially reduce accidental gun deaths and injuries for children. And ghost guns, which are handmade guns without serial numbers, are among the fastest growing gun safety problems facing our country and have recently emerged as a weapon of choice for violent criminals, gun traffickers, extremists, and other people who might be legally prohibited from buying firearms. So banning ghost guns is also really critical to improving gun safety. Now, looking at community violence intervention, which Alex gave us a good overview of, we know that gun violence is prevalent in a number of cities across the US, but especially in historically underfunded areas. This ends up intensifying longstanding inequities in health disparities, and data show that 75% of homicides involve guns, and that the majority of these homicides affect Latino and Black men living in these historically underfunded neighborhoods. Evidence-based solutions to reduce gun violence and promote safety in these communities include violence intervention programs. For many years, community-based organizations, like the ones that many of you work at, have successfully reduced violence by implementing alternative public safety measures that include both local context and are driven by local data. These are the violence intervention programs that we've been talking about, and specific initiatives within community violence intervention programs include things like street outreach, group violence intervention, safe passage programs, and hospital-based violence intervention programs. But in order to do this work and really prevent city gun violence, community-based organizations need additional support and funding. Now we'll talk a little bit about school-based attacks and policies that should be put into place to prevent them. So for the past few decades, we've unfortunately been living in a reality of increasingly frequent and lethal school shootings. School shootings have extremely negative and harmful effects that go beyond the mass shooting itself. Research shows that school-based shootings lead to drops in student enrollment and a decline in average test scores. They increase student absenteeism and the likelihood of needing to repeat a grade. And students exposed to shootings at their school are less likely to go to college and to graduate from college. As we noted before, putting an end to school-based shootings is a top priority for Latinos, and we really need meaningful, comprehensive actions to keep both schools and communities safe. Among the approaches that have proven most effective are keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have had them in the first place, which are also known as extreme risk laws. Another dangerous policy proposal that some lawmakers claim will improve student safety is arming school teachers. I want to be clear, this proposal is not based on any experience or research. And in the 10 states that have laws that are designed to allow for armed school personnel, these personnel receive significantly less training. One of the most significant risks of arming teachers is that the evidence is clear that more access to firearms is correlated strongly with an additional risk of gun violence. And another important point on this is that arming teachers or increasing the presence of law enforcement in schools can worsen fears significantly for students of color who are already subject to harsher discipline than their white classmates and disproportionately suffer from over-policing and criminalization. For example, Latino students are arrested at 1.3 times the rate of white students, and this rate is even higher for Black students. Now, the final critical piece that we want to highlight for you is the intersection of mental health with gun violence and gun safety. Gun violence and other types of trauma can have severe and long-lasting negative effects on the mental health of everyone impacted by the issue and can traumatize entire communities, as we often hear about following devastating incidents of shootings. In addressing the mental health harms of gun violence for Latinos, it's really important to understand that Latinos continue to experience barriers to accessing mental health services and supports. Some key data points on this include that approximately 18% of Latinos were uninsured in 2021, and Latino adults are the most likely group to be stressed by the lack or loss of health insurance. And finally, Latinos with any mental illness are far less likely than white people to receive mental health care that they need. UnidosUS has a fact sheet on this, and I can include a link in the chat afterwards. Now, knowing what we know and what we've just talked about, here are some key recommendations to improve mental health supports to address the trauma and mental health impact of gun violence. Among these recommendations, we recommend improving access to short and long-term funding and resources for communities impacted by gun violence to support trauma recovery. This might include things like funding for community-based organizations to respond to mental health concerns, or community health workers to help enroll people in health insurance and share information about mental health services. It also includes increasing funding for student mental health and school-based services, as well as improving the implementation of mental health parity laws to improve access to mental health care and providers. And then finally, two other quick recommendations to address these concerns are diversifying the mental health workforce and increasing funding for research and for improved data collection to fully understand the scope of gun violence's impact on Latinos and help develop effective measures to reduce such mental health concerns and violence. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand it back over to Javier now.
Thank you, Umaria, for that presentation and for sharing those intersections between race, health, mental health, gun safety, and violence. Next, I'd like to introduce Patricia Padawi Oliver, who is the co-founder of Change the Ref and also Joaquin's mom, a victim of gun violence. Patricia, I'll pass it on to you. Patricia, can you hear me?
Can you see me?
Go ahead.
Okay, you can
see you, but we can hear you.
Yeah, the host has to unblock the video. Okay, good. Let me
Stand
see.
by.
Okay, there I am.
There we go. We can see you and hear you. Go right ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I was able to make it. It was very stressful because I didn't have Wi-Fi and any kind of communication during the morning, but here I am. As you introduced me before, I am Patricia Oliver and I'm Joaquin's mom. I lost Joaquin at the Parkland shooting 5 years ago on February 14th, 2018. And ever since, my husband and I found Change the Ref, which stands for Change the Referee. So what we're trying to do, since we found the organization and we call it Change the Ref, is to make a call to action to those politicians, to those in charge, to move and to take action into the gun laws. And ever since, we've been working very hard. We haven't seen much changes, but we have to recognize that the few that we have seen so far is being a step forward. And that's what I think is important for all of us to consider, because we need to keep going and moving and fighting, because I think that the other side of the story just want us to get tired and say, okay, this is it. They are powerful. They have everything in their hands. They have the money that you want to give up. But that this is not the point. The point is that I'm still a mom of Joaquin, and I will always be. Wherever we are, we're going to be always connected. And Joaquin was a kid that was always looking for others, was always concerned about the gun problem that we have in the country. He was very concerned about what happened in Sandy Hook. He was always concerned about why the laws and the politicians didn't do anything specific to move with the background checks since he was 12 years old. He was always concerned about what happened with the AR-15s, that they didn't do anything to ban them after what happened in Sandy Hook as well. He tweeted a post on December 14th, because that's the day that what happened in Sandy Hook. I don't like to call it anniversary, because I usually relate anniversary with something positive and happy. And this is not something to celebrate, something to be, be concerned about. No, not even thinking about myself and the sadness that day means to us. So we've been doing a lot of work through art. We started with walls of demand, which means that we were painting walls in every city that it was required at the moment, or any issue that was going on in that city. So we were relating Joaquin to the issue that was going on there. And that was a way. And every time that Manuel, my husband, that was painting the walls, he was hammering 17 times the walls, representing the 17 victims of the Parkland shooting. So that makes the people that were there were very impacted to see those and hear those sounds. So we found that the way to communicate with people through walls was excellent, because they were feeling in that moment the impact of what it's like to be listening to those noises that are very close to be, gunshots, and the fact that they can be going through that moment as well. So we start moving on that direction, and then we added sculptors. So we have Joaquin in 3D, because that was at the time when they were trying to put the 3D guns, the printing 3D guns at home. So we decided to come out with Joaquin in 3D and natural size. And we brought Joaquin to die-ins in DC in front of congressmen. We were supported for a lot of them. They were dying in the middle of the winter with the snow on it, but they didn't care. So we were glad that, they were like concerned, like we were at that moment, because that's why we did that event, that activation at that day. So we've been working hard on that direction. We've been supporting, we're not too political, because we really think that we support those organizations that they are introducing bills, that they're working on the bills, that they're looking for endorsing a bill, that we push those moments to be able to others, the citizens, the regular constituents, to be able to understand the importance to be part of the solution. And even though that we haven't seen much changes on that part, we've been seeing a lot more people connected to the cause, even with our organization or regular humans, that they just want to do something and they just ask, how can I be involved? How can I help? So we invited them to be with us or any other organization, or even without any organization behind. The fact is that we need all of us together to work, because we've been seeing dramatically changes in the gun violence issue. We've been seeing how many people is been dying for that. And this particular year is being the worst year so far. So talking on that side, I think that we are accomplishing a lot. And I was in an event with Moms Demand Action as well, and I saw the race of people joining the cause. So we are bringing more awareness to more and more people, and I think that for next year that's very important. As Debbie mentioned it before, we are a large community. We are a large community that is here in the country, that we are capable and able to vote. And we are at the same time suffering to gun violence every single day. Now, today, I can tell you that I'm working in my latest project that I feel that is very powerful because it's very emotional. So we create this book along with the advertising industry. We've been working with them at the same time with a lot of projects that maybe if you go through Change the Ref, you can see more and more. If you haven't seen it today, we've been doing a lot of campaigns, always with the same purpose. And this last one is about Joaquin. It's a book that is Joaquin first school shooting. When you see the cover of the book, you're gonna see a little kid going to school with his backpack on. But when you open, it's illustrated in a children's way, and it's it's a very small book. I don't have it with me, but it has 2 holes. But once you open the book, you can see 4 holes every time you turn the page. And to me specifically, that means every single shot that Joaquin received that day. Ever since I heard what happened in a specific to Joaquin and the way he suffered, I decided to move forward with this kind of projects because this one explains, when you open the book, exactly what those kids went through that day. So it's a narrative illustrated like a children's book with language and written in a children's way, very, very simple. We did that on purpose because we need politicians to see if they can understand in a childish way. And I was in DC 2 weeks ago. I was able to deliver the book directly to 30 representatives, maybe a little bit more. And not a single one wasn't showing an emotion when they saw the book and they opened the book and they just got that information inside. So it's a very powerful tool to be used by all of us. And we create that option. The book has its own website and you can download it digitally, or also you can send it through representative digitally, or you can have it in a hard copy and you can send it to representative. We've been noticing a lot. Actually, we'll run out of books. That people is involved and people is concerned because they've been sending books to many representatives, maybe local ones, because I didn't see those names before, but the public is reacting. The citizens are reacting. Our country is not the same. I'm not gonna say since I lost Joaquin 5 years ago, I would say since 2020, we've been seeing a lot of changes, and that's why it's so urgent that we all have to be together and look for a solution. But the solution is on the streets. The solution is in our hands. And we need to keep pushing, and we need to keep speaking, and we need to be loud. And make people
Thank you,
uncomfortable.
Patricia. Patricia, thank you for that call to action and your creativity and channeling pain that I can not even begin to imagine into something so upfront and unapologetically strong. Thank you for sharing your story and for your flexibility as you travel and move around the country to do the good work that you're doing. Folks, we have a few minutes left to take some questions for our panelists. So please take the opportunity to use the Q&A function of your Zoom screen to pose questions to any of our panelists. Also be reminded that for all of you who are on the Zoom call, we will email you a recording of this webinar along with all of the slides that were shared today, in addition to some resources for you to become active. And I'd like to start with one of the questions that came in from a compañera in San Antonio, and they asked, how do I get involved? People feel hopeless about changing this problem, and so she wants to get involved. We will share with you those resources, links to many of the organizations that you heard from here today, as well as other local ones that you will be able to connect to. A question that we have here is for Dr. Sanchez. And the question is, given the data that you've shared and given polling that we see in other places, to what do you attribute the inability of Washington to address this issue in a comprehensive manner?
Well, I think that's the frustrating piece when we all see, it seems like weekly, a mass shooting, right? A lot of elected officials saying, we are with you with our prayers, et cetera, but no policy action. And I think part of connecting the dots to the first question of what can we do on this issue, I think as the last speaker presented, be louder on this issue, right? More vocal, not only in terms of contacting public officials, but also mobilizing more of our community to vote on these issues, and not just at the federal level. I think one important detail that often gets left out of the equation is we're seeing in a lot of states very progressive movement among governors in the state legislature to try to make something happen on gun control policy. But then unfortunately in conservative areas in those states, you actually see county governments pushing back tremendously on that. So be loud, be vocal, increase pressure on elected officials to move on this action. And don't forget about the local level and those discussions. Let's not just focus all of our energy on Congress.
Thank you for that response. Let me move on to another question here, and this is open-ended, so whoever wants to take a stab at it, please go right ahead. But the question is, where do educators fit into this issue of preventing gun violence?
Hi, Javier. I can say a little bit about where educators fit. I think they carry such a heavy burden because they have to now be not only in charge of educating our children, but now they have to worry about active shooter drills in the schools and the trauma that carries for them and also for the children. I think that the best thing that a lot of the teachers and any members of the administration in these schools can do is have heart-to-heart conversations with our children. Make sure that if they see any suspicious activity, to sit them down and ask them if there's anything going on at home. I think that educating children on the safety of locking arms safely, of not touching them, is also incredibly important. If they see something, they must report it. A lot of the community shootings that we're seeing is kids getting firearms either from their parents' house and they give it to their friends, or through gangs, unfortunately. And a lot of the homicides that we're seeing as well is by children or by teens between the ages of 14 and 17, and a lot of them go unreported. The police can never find the culprits. There's like a code of silence among a lot of these groups. So I think it's important to communicate to earn their trust, so that if they see something, they must report it to a teacher or to a trusted adult, so that we can prevent some of the shootings that we see every single day in our communities.
And I'll just quickly add that teachers can speak out against school hardening measures and measures to arm teachers with guns. There's this really false idea, like I talked about, that arming teachers and school staff will make schools safer, but in reality, and according to the evidence, armed teachers can't, in this moment of extreme stress and confusion, be expected to transform into a law enforcement officer. And so teachers should be pressing also, like the rest of us are, for evidence-based solutions and interventions, like accessing mental health supports for students and providing school-based mental health services for students as well.
Thank you both for that response. This one is for Patricia. Patricia, where do we get a copy of Joaquin's book? And you are muted.
Okay.
There you go. We can hear you now.
You can go through myfirstschoolshooting.com.
myfirstschoolshooting.com, and we'll put that in the chat as well so that folks can access that resource. We have another question here. Early childhood parent leaders are already concerned about this topic. What do you feel we can focus on for the kids ages 0 to 8 and help assist those community preventive programs? This one might be good for either Umalia maybe, or Alex. Question is, early childhood parent leaders are already concerned about this issue. What do you feel we can focus on for kids ages 0 to 8 and help assist with these community preventative programs?
I can try and answer this question. I think the biggest thing is making sure, for me, the biggest thing for children is making sure that they can't get access to guns in their home. And I think the other thing is making sure that you're talking to your children about like why school shooting drills might be happening, and making sure that their social emotional health is being tended to, because it is scary and it is something that a lot of children, and as we see now, a lot of young adults are dealing with sort of the mental health repercussions.
Thank you, Alex. Umalia, anything to add to that before we close?
No, I just echo what Alex said. Those are both good points. Just emphasizing the safe storage that parents can do if they do have a gun in their home, and providing their children with mental health supports.
Fantastic. Thank you. I want to thank all of our attendees today. I want to thank our panelists and co-hosts, including BSP Research, UnidosUS, Giffords, for your time. I want to thank especially Patricia for sharing your story with us and your call to action. Just to leave you with I think some hopeful words. I am based out of New Mexico, and in New Mexico over the last 4 years, we've taken some very aggressive measures for gun safety. We passed universal background checks. We have a red flag law. This last legislative session, we passed a safe storage bill that is now the law of the land. All of these victories have been spearheaded by families like yourselves, families who organized and said, ya basta, no más, no more. So there's a lot of work to do, but I believe that collectively we will be able to accomplish the goal of ensuring that our children are safe when they go to school, that our families are safe when they go grocery shopping, that no one, again, has to face the scourge of gun violence. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day. We will follow up with an email with this recording and the slides and with the resources for you to get involved in your community. Have a great day.